Was a bit of an odd child, as I now know all children are in their own way. I lived in my head and struggled to integrate my inner and outer life sometimes. And some of you may be nodding your head saying, you still do, Jake. I was a shy kid. I had two friends that I would die for and would die for me, but not a huge circle. When I was in fourth grade, I remember a particular moment of realizing that I was odd. It was raining during recess time that day, so we all stayed inside the classroom during recess, but could do whatever we wanted. Some kids were playing board games. I had cut strips of paper about this long and about that wide and colored them to look like my favorite professional wrestlers, Sting and Goldberg. And I was having wrestling matches on my desk with strips of paper. Odd. Now that I have kids with active imaginations, I understand it's not quite as odd as I thought it was then, but still, this is fourth grade. My teacher must have watched me and been a little concerned by what she saw. She's a very kind woman, so Mrs. Farrell called me to her desk and asked me if I was okay. Of course. Why? And I can see the struggle on her face as she wrestled with how to answer that question. And she decided against it and said, well, good, I just wanted to check on you. And I went back to my desk wondering what in the world that was about. I picked up my strips of paper and continued my wrestling match. And I went, oh, this. As I looked around the class and saw that other kids were playing board games or talking and things like that, and I was playing with strips of paper. Maybe this is a little odd. I remember that story all these years later because it was one of my earliest memories of wondering what it was like to be different from other kids in this way, wondering where I fit in. Now that I've worked with kids and youth, I recognize this isn't a unique experience. Not at all. We all have idiosyncratic things that make us different. Some of us, those things are more obvious than others. Some of us, those things are on the outside. Some of us, those things are on the inside. But we all have thoughts and behaviors and patterns that are unique to us. And when we're young, it's good and natural to go through a process of differentiating, of seeing the ways we are different, to learn who it is we are. Most kids don't play pro wrestler with strips of paper in fourth grade. I'm different in that way. So what did that mean about me? Maybe it was as simple as that I had an active imagination and was more comfortable in my own head than I was with other people. And now I know that that hardly makes me unique. But I had to learn that. I'm giving that story probably greater significance this morning than it merits, but I hope to draw a parallel between that experience of my own and those experiences that we all have with Israel's experience as a people set apart by God. God intentionally draws them out of the crowd in order to be different, in order to be strange. On purpose, God does this. To be Israel is to be set apart as God's people, apart from all the other peoples of the world in Israel's history. And the Jewish dietary laws are cumbersome on purpose and are a great example of this. One of my partners, when I was in the residency program, he was the year beneath me. When he came to interview, he was a vegetarian. And so the meal we had during the interview was pulled pork sandwiches and coleslaw. And he drew no attention to it on purpose. But when he made his sandwich and got back to the table and sat down, we all saw that it's a coleslaw sandwich. He couldn't hide. He couldn't blend in. The Jewish dietary laws are designed to do exactly this, to make it impossible for them to fully integrate into any other society or to even blend in with the world around them. The best example I know to give of that in Israel's history is during the Babylonian exile. In 587 BC, Babylon marched into Judah and decimated them, destroyed the temple, took their ruling class and their rich folks, and then came back a second time and took their middle class and marched them across the known world, across the Middle East, and resettled them on the far side in Babylon. And they did this not just to Israel, they did this to a ton of other nations and ethnicities and people groups. So that in Babylon, the Israelites are surrounded by people from all cultures, all religions, all over the world. It's what we would call a pluralistic society. Different religions, cultures, ethnicities, all represented in the city square, working, finding cohesion somehow. And in this environment, in exile, it's very, very important that the Jewish people not be assimilated into the world around them, that they don't pick up Babylonian morals or unethical practices. So how do you resist assimilation when your identity as a people group is genuinely at stake? Well, you study and practice the law codes, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. You eat strange diet and you wear strange clothes. You don't wear clothes fashioned from two fabrics. You wear single fabric garments because you are to be one single garment, not mixed with those around you. One people, God's people, no mixing. And for a people who have just been handed their biggest defeat in Hebrew history, I bet some of them wanted to do anything but stand out. I bet they wanted to wear normal clothes and integrate. They're depressed, lost, and wrestling with how this could happen to them. Is God really as powerful as He said? If this happened to us, is God really on our side if this happened to us? And why wear clothes and eat in such a strange way that makes us stand out as people defined by this God who seems to have lost in this battle? I'm sure they would have loved to cut the locks of their hair or shop in the market with other folks. I'm sure they got sick and tired of everybody else talking about how lazy those Jewish people are for taking a Sabbath off to just do nothing one day a week. And no doubt some of the Jewish people did exactly this. They assimilated, they integrated into Babylonian society, and who can blame them? But remarkably, miraculously, most of them didn't. They actually doubled down on these practices, practicing the dietary laws, the dress codes, and Sabbath observance with more fervor in Babylon than they ever did back in Israel and Judah. Now, isn't that interesting? In Babylon, it set them apart and it made them different, and it preserved their identity as a people. My friend Waylon Upchigo pastors the All Tribes Baptist Church in Gary, Oklahoma. He told me a story of being invited to a sweat that all the native spiritual leaders in the community were invited to. And though he's a Christian, it was still very important for him to go and preserve these rituals that reminded him and his community of who they are and where they come from, rituals to prevent them and their way of life from being utter and completely assimilated and annihilated. That's the effect it has on the Jewish people in Babylon, too. These rituals save their community and preserve their heritage and their sense of belonging together as a people. When they're in a world that is disorienting, these laws orient them. They pull them together. When the world has been demolished, these laws put them back together as a people. And they take Excuse me. And after 70 years of practicing a faith that is necessarily exclusionary in Babylon, a great shift happens. Persia defeats Babylon. King Cyrus of Persia, who is named a Messiah in the book of Isaiah, gives the Jewish people permission to return to the land of promise. And they do. And they take their Babylonian kind of faith with them. This necessarily exclusionary faith goes back to Israel with these pilgrims. How could it not? These things have saved their lives for 70 years. Most of the people that are returning to Israel from Babylon have never been to Israel. They were born in Babylon. This is the only expression of Jewish faith that they've ever known. And so they return to Israel, and there is a clash immediately. See, back in Israel, not all the people are taken into exile. The lower class and the poor were left there, and to survive, they do something with their faith quite opposite from what people in Babylon did. These people, using different texts from the same scriptures to guide them, they make peace with many of the nations around them. Enemies became friends and married their sons and daughters. In some way, the promised land, like Babylon, was on its way to being an ethnic and national melting pot with all of the intermarriages and the blending of cultures that's taking place there. So Jewish faith in Babylon, as it grows more necessarily exclusionary, at the same time Jewish faith in Israel grows more necessarily hospitable. I love y'all. A clash was inevitable. When these people get back, when the Babylonian Jewish folks arrive in Israel, they see this more hospitable faith practice there as a threat. How can they not? It's a heresy. It's against what their faith has become, against everything they've come to find meaning in. They left Babylon to find Babylon in Israel, and something has to be done about it. They have to remain a people set apart from all the other peoples. So now you get to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and the other Babylonian Jewish people who, as soon as they arrive back in Israel with money sponsored from King Cyrus, they take power back. They step back into their old roles as ruling over the people culturally, politically, religiously. And they decide that it is in line with their faith, no mixing, to expel all of the infidels from Israel, all of the wives from other countries, and all of the children from those marriages. And elders from the community go door to door evicting people when husbands are too soft-hearted to do it themselves. They're sent out into the wilderness to find a new home, build a new life, or just disappear. And we never hear from them in the biblical story again. It's one of my least favorite stories in the Bible, but I think it's one of the most instructive in understanding Israel's relationship with the law and in understanding Israel's relationship with the law in the time of Jesus even, and in the time where Peter's vision took place. You see, by the time we get to the New Testament, Judaism is anything but a monolith. It is at least as diverse as Baptists in America. When guests come in, and I'm sure many of you here have heard me ask this question, I always ask, how did you find your way here this morning? And if they say, well, I Googled Baptist churches close to me, I go, I don't think you're going to find what you're looking for here. And I hope they'll be pleasantly surprised by what they find, but usually that means they're looking for something different than what we offer, and that's okay. Sometimes they are pleasantly surprised, sometimes not, but it is a revelation to many, one way or the other, that there are many ways to be Baptist, and that there are many ways to be Christian in this world, more than they had previously imagined. Judaism in Jesus' day is similar. The characteristics of what I've been calling Babylonian faith have in many ways won out. In many ways, this is represented in some of the clashes that Jesus has with the religious leaders. But we would be wrong to say that it is the only expression of Jewish faith. Thank you for being patient with me this morning. It's the dominant view, just like we might say Southern Baptists are the dominant view of Baptists in America, but we also have American Baptists and Cooperative Baptists and Alliance of Baptists like us. And though we practice the same faith as our Southern Baptist, we practice it differently and have a different set of core values. We are still Christians practicing one faith in perhaps quite different ways. By the time Jesus comes along, Babylonian faith is the dominant expression of faith in the New Testament, with its emphasis on the law codes and rigid demands for keeping the law and purity. It isn't empty rituals, never. It's rituals that connect them with their past, that connect them with the God that reached into their history and saved them at their most vulnerable moments. These laws have deep value in the community. But Jesus seems to be practicing a faith much more like those that's left behind in Israel. One focused on hospitality and inclusion and mercy instead of purity and exclusion and wrath. Neither expression is wrong, and indeed I think they both serve their places in the history of Israel in necessary ways, but Jesus makes no apologies when he says it isn't what goes into your mouth that makes you unclean, it's what comes out. This is a direct attack on the dietary laws, because what comes out is a reflection of your heart. And the Jewish leaders press him on this. They press him on the dietary customs and Sabbath laws that he seems to keep breaking. And Jesus tells them he isn't here to abolish the law, even if his behavior seems to give that impression. The law is fulfilled. And that may not sound like a big difference, but the distinction there, I think, is an important one. To say the dietary laws aren't abolished but fulfilled is to acknowledge that they served a really important purpose at one point in Israel's history. They set the people apart. They preserved their heritage and identity when that was the highest goal. Israel did not go quietly into the night when they so easily could have. And the law code that God gave them was essential to that. The best way I know how to describe how this functions, I think, is to think of restrictions on a driver's license, maybe. A 15-year-old can get a driver's permit that allows them to drive with an adult in the car, right? You can get a worker's permit at 15 that allows you to drive to and from work as long as no one is in the car. But when you turn 16, those laws are lifted. It isn't because they were bad laws, not at all. They were good and necessary, but their season has passed and they've been outgrown. Jesus says that the dietary laws have served their purpose well. The role of the law is complete. It did its job and it did it good. But that stage is complete. And the next stage is going to be less exclusionary and more inclusive. It's going to be less about purity and more about mercy, less law and more love. And that's what Peter's vision is all about this morning. No animal is unclean. That was for a specific time, a specific place, but it wasn't the animals that were unclean. It was the season of life that demanded these difficult measures. And that season has passed. Where you once needed to button down the hatches and huddle tightly to survive, now it's time to throw wide the gates and announce from the rooftops that God shows no partiality to anyone or everyone, no matter who, no matter where, no matter when. Everyone is welcomed into the family of God. Wayland Upchigo's church that I was talking about a minute ago went through a conversation a few years ago. They used to be a church for one specific tribe, which is not uncommon. And through a process of discerning, of studying the Scripture, and of searching themselves, they pivoted. They changed their name and they changed their mission to represent a much more inclusive faith. And they changed their name to All Tribes Church. Everyone is welcome. As I said in the beginning of this, I was somewhat of an odd child. Athletic, sure, but I didn't like to sweat much. I was bookish and quiet, so quiet. I'm sure you're surprised by that. I'm still just a little fourth grade introvert hiding behind a loud voice and a big smile, so be kind. Now, my family was outdoorsy and I wanted to read books, but I had someone in my life who saw me. When we went to stay with my grandparents, my brother would pack up and go hunting with my grandfather, and I don't mind hunting. I've got nothing against it in any way except my toes being cold. I cannot stand cold toes, and it was simple as that. So when they went hunting, I stayed with my grandmother, warm by the fire. She taught me to sew, and we sewed pillows and blankets for my mom and my dad. She taught me how to embroider their names into them. My grandmother was a literature teacher, so we stitched and she read to me the classics. The Odyssey of Homer was my favorite. She had a contemporary translation of Romeo and Juliet that I was riveted by long before I got into high school and knew I wasn't supposed to like reading these things. And the way I read the Bible, or read it today, is at least as much influenced by the way my grandmother read literature to me as a child than any class I ever took in seminary. And there beside her, beside the fire, with a needle in my hand and a book in hers, I belonged. I felt seen and loved and admired, not in spite of the characteristics that made me strange to my cousins, but because of them. My grandmother celebrated my strangeness, and she celebrated me. And I think that's the heart of Christian inclusion. It isn't just that anyone is welcome, it's that you are, just as you are. And you will be celebrated by God for who you are. I want you to think of the people in your life that do this for you. It may just be 2 or 3 folks, and it is a rare gift. And those people and those relationships are signposts. Paul calls them foretastes. They point toward the kind of communion and safety and celebration that we will enjoy in the presence of the Spirit of God and get to in small, valuable, and meaningful ways here and there along the way. Oh, how wonderful Cornelius must have felt to learn that he and his household were accepted by God long before any man, even Peter, told them they were. See, inclusion is the work of the Spirit, and celebration is the work of the church. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.